In the autumn of 1944, somewhere in the forested hills near the German-Belgian border, a Wehrmacht technical evaluation unit received an object that would fundamentally challenge everything they understood about American military precision. The item arrived in a wooden crate marked only with chalk numbers, accompanied by a single-page field report written in rushed handwriting. Inside lay an M1903 Springfield rifle, fitted with an 8-power Untold scope, its stock scarred by combat, its barrel still carrying the faint chemical trace of recent fire. The rifle had been recovered from the body of an American sniper who had held an entire company pinned for 6 hours before a mortar strike silenced his position. What the Germans found when they test-fired that weapon would haunt their ordnance reports for months and force them to confront an uncomfortable truth about the war they thought they were winning. The rifle arrived at testing station Kummersdorf on October 12th, logged as item 4A771 in the Enemy Weapons Analysis Registry. Oberst Friedrich Weiss, a career artillery officer with a doctorate in ballistics from Dresden, was assigned to lead the evaluation. Weiss had spent 2 decades studying rifle design, had personally examined captured Soviet Mosin Nagants, British Lee Enfields, and French MAS-36s. He approached the Springfield with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a patient he expected to understand within minutes. He did not expect to spend the next 3 weeks writing reports that his superiors would initially refuse to believe. The Springfield was not supposed to be this good. American infantry weapons were considered adequate but unexceptional, functional tools built for mass production, not precision instruments. The German military mindset, shaped by decades of Mauser engineering excellence, held that Germanic attention to detail and craftsmanship created superior weapons. The M1903 challenged that entire worldview with every shot fired. Weiss began with the standard protocol: visual inspection, measurement of tolerances, examination of bore condition, trigger pull analysis. The rifle showed clear signs of field use. The wooden stock was marked with scratches and dents. The metal bore faint traces of copper fouling. The scope housing carried a small dent from what appeared to be shrapnel impact. Yet when Weiss mounted the rifle in a mechanical rest and fired his first test group at 100 meters, he paused, rechecked his target placement, and fired again. The 5-shot group measured 1.2 centimeters center to center. He increased the range to 300 meters. The group opened to 3.8 centimeters. At 600 meters, under light wind conditions, the rifle maintained a group diameter of less than 12 centimeters. Weiss noted in his initial report, dated October 14th, accuracy exceeds specifications of current Wehrmacht sniper weapons. Recommend immediate expanded testing. His superiors approved the request, but added a marginal note questioning whether the test conditions had been properly controlled. They were suggesting politely that Weiss had made an error. He had not made an error. Over the following week, Weiss assembled a team of 3 additional engineers and conducted the most comprehensive foreign weapon evaluation ever undertaken at Kummersdorf. They tested the Springfield against the Karabiner 98K with ZF-42 scope, the standard German sniper rifle, and against captured Soviet sniper variants. They fired from mechanical rests, from field positions, from prone and supported stances. They tested in morning cold and afternoon heat, in dry conditions and after artificial rain exposure. They measured barrel harmonics, bedding stability, scope return to 0 after shock, and trigger consistency across 200 rounds. The M1903 outperformed the K98K in 14 of 17 measurable categories. The Soviet rifles weren't even close. By October 22nd, Weiss was writing reports that used words like exceptional, unprecedented, and most damning of all, superior to domestic production. Those words would cost him his next promotion and earn him a quiet reassignment to a logistics depot in Bavaria 3 months later. Speaking uncomfortable truths about German technical inferiority was not a career-enhancing decision in late 1944, but the numbers did not lie. and numbers were Weiss's religion. The M1903's receiver was machined to tolerances the Germans associated with custom hunting rifles, not military mass production. The barrel showed a level of bore consistency that suggested manufacturing quality control beyond what Wehrmacht armories achieved even in peacetime. The trigger broke cleanly at 1.8 kilograms with minimal creep, better than German sniper triggers that were individually hand-fitted by gunsmiths. Most disturbing was the scope mounting system. The inertial optic sat on externally adjustable mounts that allowed the scope to slide rearward under recoil, then return precisely to battery. German engineers had experimented with similar systems and abandoned them as too complex for field conditions. Yet here was an American rifle, carried by an enlisted soldier, featuring a mounting system that worked flawlessly after obvious combat abuse. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How had the Americans, supposedly focused on quantity over quality, produced a weapon that combined mass production methods with precision rivaling custom European sporting rifles? Weiss requested information about American manufacturing processes. The intelligence reports that came back described factories where women operated automated machinery, where standardized parts were produced by the millions, where assembly lines moved rifles from station to station with mechanical efficiency. There were no master gunsmiths hand-fitting each action, no individually lapped barrels, no custom trigger work. Yet somehow, the rifles that emerged from those factories shot better than weapons built by craftsmen in small German workshops. The answer, Weiss slowly realized, lay not in craftsmanship but in engineering philosophy. The Americans had designed the entire system, rifle, ammunition, scope, as an integrated whole, with each component optimized to work with the others. They had applied industrial quality control at a scale the Germans had never attempted. They had treated precision as a manufacturing problem to be solved through process control rather than as an art to be practiced by skilled individuals. It was a fundamentally different approach to warfare, and it was working. On November 3, 1944, Weiss submitted his final report. It ran to 47 pages and included photographic documentation, statistical analysis, and comparative ballistic charts. His conclusion was stated in the dry language of technical documentation, but carried an unmistakable subtext. The M1903 Springfield rifle with inertial scope represents a weapon system of exceptional combat effectiveness. Current Wehrmacht sniper weapons do not achieve equivalent performance in field conditions. Recommend immediate review of domestic production standards and consideration of design modifications based on captured enemy examples. And the report was classified Geheim, secret, and distributed to a restricted list of senior ordnance officers. Most of them never read it. By November 1944, the German war machine was collapsing from fuel shortages, strategic bombing, and the advance of Allied armies on two fronts. There was no time, no resources, and no political will to admit that American rifles were better than German ones. The report was filed, Weiss was reassigned, and the uncomfortable truth was buried in paperwork. But the rifle remained, locked in a storage room at Kummersdorf, alongside hundreds of other captured weapons. When Soviet forces overran the facility in April 1945, they found the testing records and the weapons themselves. The M1903 was eventually shipped to a technical institute in Moscow, where it was examined by Soviet engineers who reached the same conclusions Weiss had. By then, the war was over, and the question of who made better sniper rifles was a matter of historical analysis rather than tactical urgency. The American soldier who had carried that rifle died in combat, his name recorded in casualty lists, but never connected to the weapon that had impressed his enemies. His family received a telegram and a Purple Heart. They never knew that German engineers had spent weeks studying the rifle he'd used, never knew that their son's weapon had forced an enemy army to confront its own technical limitations. The steel and wood he'd carried into battle had spoken a truth that no propaganda could silence. Precision was not the sole province of any nation, and excellence could emerge from factories as readily as from craftsmen's benches. Friedrich Weiss did not begin his military career expecting to become a chronicler of German technical decline. Born in Leipzig in 1897, he had served as an artillery observer in the Great War, survived the Western Front, and returned home with a conviction that future wars would be won by those who understood ballistics better than their enemies. He studied mechanical engineering at Dresden Technical University, wrote his doctoral dissertation on barrel harmonics and projectile stability, and joined the Wehrmacht's Ordnance Testing Division in 1935 with the quiet enthusiasm of a man who believed that precision and reason could answer any technical question. By 1944, he had examined hundreds of weapons from dozens of nations. He knew the characteristics of every major rifle system in combat. He thought he understood the hierarchy of military firearms design. The M1903 Springfield taught him that understanding and hubris were often the same thing. The first anomaly appeared during the bore examination. Weiss used an optical bore scope to inspect the rifling, the spiral grooves cut into the barrel's interior that impart spin to the bullet. The standard German process involved button rifling or cut rifling, both of which could leave subtle tool marks visible under magnification. The Springfield's bore showed almost none. The lands and grooves were uniform to a degree that suggested either an extraordinarily skilled gunsmith had hand-lapped the barrel or the manufacturing process itself had achieved a level of consistency Weiss had only seen in experimental target rifles. He measured the groove depth at 6 points along the barrel's length. The variation was less than 0.01 millimeters. In a mass-produced military weapon, this was remarkable. In a weapon that had clearly seen combat, it was nearly inexplicable. Barrels degraded with use, especially under the heat and pressure of sustained firing. This barrel, despite evidence of several hundred rounds fired, maintained dimensional stability that would have satisfied a competition shooter. Weiss moved on to headspace measurement, the critical distance between the bolt face and the chamber shoulder that determined how securely the cartridge was held during firing. Improper headspace caused accuracy problems and could be dangerous, allowing excessive case expansion that led to ruptures. The M1903's headspace fell within military specifications, but barely. It was on the tight end of the acceptable range, which meant less case movement, more consistent ignition, and better accuracy. German military specifications allowed for slightly looser headspace to ensure reliability under field conditions: mud, cold, imperfect ammunition. The American approach sacrificed a small measure of reliability for a measurable gain in precision. It was a conscious design choice that revealed something about American tactical doctrine. They expected their soldiers to maintain their weapons and believed accuracy was worth the trade-off. Weiss noted this in his report with a certain grudging respect. Different philosophies of warfare, both valid, but the American approach was proving devastatingly effective in the hands of trained snipers. The trigger mechanism fascinated him. German military triggers were designed for reliability and simplicity, springs, levers, and sears that would function in the worst conditions, but often broke with a creep and over-travel that degraded shot placement. The Springfield's trigger was a two-stage design that allowed for a consistent, predictable break. The first stage took up slack. The second stage engaged the sear with minimal additional pressure. East tested it 200 times with a trigger pull gauge, recording each measurement. The variance across 200 pulls was less than 50 grams. This level of consistency required either careful hand-fitting or extraordinary quality control in parts manufacturing. Intelligence reports indicated the Americans used interchangeable parts and minimal hand-fitting. Weiss was beginning to understand that American industrial processes were more sophisticated than German propaganda acknowledged. The ability to mass-produce precision components at scale was a form of technical excellence Germany had not matched, despite its reputation for engineering prowess. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing which places and moments, day or night, these documented accounts reach. On October 18th, Weiss conducted a field simulation test. He took the M1903 and a standard K98K sniper rifle to an outdoor range and fired both weapons from realistic field positions, prone with bipod, kneeling with sling support, standing off-hand. He used standard military ammunition for each weapon and recorded group sizes at 300 meters. The Springfield averaged 4.2 centimeters for 5-shot groups. The K98K averaged 7.1 centimeters. The difference might seem small, but at extended ranges, it compounded dramatically. At 600 meters, the Springfield's groups measured roughly 12 centimeters. The K98K's groups opened to 23 centimeters. This meant an American sniper could reliably hit a man-sized target at ranges where a German sniper was merely hoping for a lucky shot. In tactical terms, the American weapon gave its user a killing zone that extended 100 meters beyond what German snipers could achieve with confidence. That 100 meters represented a zone of invulnerability where American marksmen could operate with impunity while German soldiers were exposed and vulnerable. Weiss documented all of this in photographs and statistical tables. He prepared ballistic charts showing trajectory comparison, wind drift calculation, and hit probability at various ranges. He wrote in the measured prose of technical documentation, but beneath the professional language lay a more personal realization. The weapon he was testing represented a philosophy of warfare fundamentally different from Germany's. The Germans had built their military around the idea of individual excellence, elite soldiers, superior training, tactical brilliance compensating for numerical disadvantages. The Americans had built their military around systems, industrial production, standardized training, equipment good enough that average soldiers could achieve extraordinary results. The Springfield embodied that philosophy. It was not a custom rifle built for an elite marksman. It was a mass-produced weapon designed to make any trained soldier a deadly threat at extended range. The democracy of lethality. Every infantryman a potential sniper. His superiors' response to his initial reports was predictable. They questioned his methodology, suggested he retest under more controlled conditions, implied that environmental factors might have skewed results. Weiss understood what they were really saying. These results are politically unacceptable. Admitting that American weapons were superior undermined the narrative of German technical supremacy that justified continued resistance despite overwhelming strategic disadvantage. So Weiss retested. He brought in external observers, used fresh ammunition, calibrated all measuring instruments, and documented every step with photographic evidence. The results did not change. The Springfield remained superior in almost every measurable category. Weiss submitted his expanded report on October 25th. The response was silence for 3 days, then a terse acknowledgement and orders to continue his regular duties. No one wanted to discuss the implications. No one wanted to admit that the Americans had out-engineered them in at least this one critical area. In early November, Weiss received a visitor, Hauptmann Dietrich Kohl, an intelligence officer who specialized in Allied weapons systems. Kohl arrived unannounced, reviewed Weiss's reports, examined the rifle personally, and then asked a single question. "What do you think this means?" Weiss, exhausted from weeks of politically fraught testing, answered honestly, "It means we underestimated them. We assumed quantity was their only advantage. We were wrong. Cole nodded slowly, then said something Weiss would remember for the rest of his life. "The problem, Oberst, is that understanding this changes nothing. We cannot retool our factories, cannot redesign our weapons, cannot train new gunsmiths. We can only fight with what we have and hope it's enough." Cole left, taking a copy of the report with him. Weiss never learned what happened to it, though he suspected it was buried in some bureaucratic archive where uncomfortable truths went to die. By mid-November, Weiss was reassigned. Officially, the transfer was routine rotation. Unofficially, he had become an embarrassment, a respected officer whose findings contradicted official doctrine. He spent the remaining months of the war managing ammunition stockpiles in Bavaria, far from the testing ranges and technical debates. The M1903 remained at Kummersdorf, a piece of steel and wood that had forced an army to confront the limits of its own mythology. After the war, Weiss returned to academic life, teaching engineering at a small technical college. He never spoke publicly about the Springfield report, but in private correspondence with former colleagues, he occasionally mentioned "the American rifle that taught me humility." It was not the lesson he had expected to learn in 1944, but it was perhaps the most important one. Excellence could emerge from any source, and the nation that recognized that fact first would likely win the next war. The rifle that impressed Oberst Weiss was manufactured in April 1943 at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. It was one of approximately 60,000 M1903A4 sniper variants produced during the war, each built to specifications developed through decades of military and civilian shooting experience. The rifle's serial number, logged in Weiss's reports as 3407821, allowed later historians to trace its production back to a specific week on a specific assembly line, operated by workers whose names never appeared in any official record. This anonymity was central to the weapon's nature. It was not crafted by a master gunsmith, but assembled by ordinary men and women following precise industrial processes. The genius of the M1903 lay not in individual artistry, but in the systematic application of quality control standards across thousands of identical rifles. It was the triumph of process over personality, and it terrified German officers who had built their entire military culture around the cult of individual excellence. The Springfield Armory had been producing rifles since 1777, but by the 1940s, it had transformed from a traditional gun workshop into a modern industrial facility. The production process for the M1903A4 involved dozens of separate operations, each performed by workers who specialized in a single task. One worker might spend an entire shift installing triggers. Another might focus solely on chambering barrels. A third might handle final headspace adjustment. This division of labor allowed for extreme specialization, but required rigorous quality control to ensure that parts from different stations would fit together properly. The armory employed inspectors at every stage of production, checking dimensions with precision gauges and rejecting components that fell outside tolerance ranges. It was this systematic inspection process, far more than any individual craftsmanship, that produced rifles capable of impressing German engineers. The Americans had industrialized precision. The barrel was the heart of the weapon's accuracy, and its manufacturing process illustrated the sophistication of American gunmaking. The armory used a cold hammer forging process that formed the barrel around a mandrel, creating the rifling through compression rather than cutting. This method produced barrels with extremely consistent bore dimensions and minimal residual stress. After forging, each barrel was subjected to a stress-relieving heat treatment that prevented warping over time. Then came the critical step, air gauge inspection. Technicians inserted pneumatic measuring devices into the bore and used air pressure differentials to detect dimensional variations smaller than a human eye could see. Barrels that showed excessive variation were rejected and melted down for reforging. Only barrels that met stringent dimensional standards progressed to the next stage. This level of inspection was rare in military production, but standard at Springfield Armory. The Americans had decided that precision was not a luxury, but a requirement. The receiver, the steel housing that held the bolt and barrel, received similar attention. Each receiver was milled from a solid steel forging, with critical dimensions held to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The bolt raceway, the recoil lug mortise, the barrel threads, all were machined on automated equipment that could maintain consistency across thousands of units. After machining, each receiver was hardened through heat treatment, then tempered to achieve the right balance of strength and toughness. Finally, inspectors used precision gauges to verify that all critical dimensions remained within specification after heat treatment. Receivers that had warped or shifted during hardening were rejected. This rejection rate, the percentage of parts that failed inspection, was a source of constant concern for production managers who faced pressure to meet military quotas. But the Armory's leadership, backed by Army ordnance specifications, refused to lower standards to increase output. They understood that a sniper rifle that missed its target was worse than useless. It was a liability that got soldiers killed. The stock, often dismissed as a simple wooden component, actually played a crucial role in the rifle's accuracy. Wood was not inert. It absorbed moisture, expanded and contracted with temperature changes, and could warp over time. These dimensional changes affected how the barrel contacted the stock, which in turn affected accuracy. The M1903A4 used a carefully designed bedding system that controlled barrel contact points and allowed for some wood movement without degrading performance. The Armory used seasoned walnut that had been dried for months to reduce moisture content. Stock makers then inletted the wood to precise dimensions, ensuring that the barrel made contact with the stock only at specific points. The rest of the barrel floated free, isolated from the wood's dimensional changes. This free-floating barrel design was common in target rifles, but rare in military weapons, which typically used full-length stock contact for durability. The American decision to prioritize accuracy over simplicity reflected a calculated judgment about the role of sniper rifles in modern warfare. Assembly was the final critical stage. Workers fitted barrels to receivers, adjusted headspace with precision gauges, installed triggers and tested pull weight, and mounted scopes on precision bases. Each rifle then went to the test range, where it was fired for accuracy verification. Rifles that failed to meet a minimum accuracy standard, typically 4-inch groups at 100 yards, were disassembled and inspected for defects. Sometimes the problem was a defective component that could be replaced. Sometimes it was an assembly error that could be corrected. Occasionally, a rifle simply would not shoot accurately despite having all the right parts properly assembled, a mysterious failure that hinted at factors beyond the engineer's understanding. These rifles were marked as training weapons and never issued to snipers. The ones that passed, rifles like the one that would eventually reach Oberst Weiss's testing bench, were packed in Cosmoline-coated paper, crated, and shipped to training centers where they would be issued to soldiers selected for sniper instruction. The scout scope mounted on the rifle was equally sophisticated. The Untold 8-power scope used in the M1903A4 system was a civilian design adapted for military use. It featured external micrometer adjustments that allowed for precise windage and elevation changes, a crucial capability for long-range shooting where even minor errors could cause misses. The scope's reticle, the aiming point visible through the optic, was a simple crosshair design that allowed for quick target acquisition while maintaining precision. But the most innovative feature was the mounting system. The scope sat on 2 mounts that allowed it to slide rearward under recoil, then return to position through spring tension. This recoil-absorbing design protected the scope's internal optics from the violent shock of firing while maintaining zero, the alignment between point of aim and point of impact. German engineers who examined this system later admitted they had considered similar designs but rejected them as too complex for field conditions. The Americans built it, tested it, and deployed it successfully. Theory met practice, and practice won. The soldier who carried serial number 3407821 into combat never knew any of this. He knew his rifle shot where he aimed it, knew it held zero after being dropped or knocked around, knew he could trust it when lives depended on a single shot. He did not know about the inspectors who had checked his barrel's bore dimensions, the heat treat specialists who had tempered his receiver, the test range shooters who had verified his rifle's accuracy before it was shipped. He did not know that his rifle embodied decades of accumulated knowledge about ballistics, metallurgy, and manufacturing. He only knew it worked. When German soldiers found his body after the mortar strike, they recovered the rifle and sent it to the rear for technical evaluation. It arrived at Kummersdorf covered in mud and blood, a combat tool transformed into a historical artifact. The invisible craftsmen who had built it, the machinists and inspectors and test shooters, never learned that their work had impressed an enemy army. They simply moved on to the next rifle, the next barrel, the next inspection, confident that their systematic precision would, in aggregate, help win a war. The rifle Oberst Weiss examined was not merely a piece of hardware. It was the physical manifestation of an American tactical doctrine that prioritized standoff engagement and force multiplication. While German sniper doctrine emphasized individual marksmanship and close integration with infantry units, the American approach treated snipers as independent assets capable of dominating terrain through superior range and accuracy. The M1903A4 was designed to enable this doctrine, providing riflemen with the ability to engage targets at distances where enemy return fire was ineffective. This philosophical difference, reflected in steel and wood, explained why the Springfield impressed German evaluators. It was not just better engineered, it was engineered for a different kind of warfare, one that the Germans were slowly losing by late 1944. American sniper training in World War II emphasized fieldcraft, concealment, and patience, but the foundation of the program was marksmanship at extended ranges. Sniper candidates spent weeks on rifle ranges, learning to judge distance, compensate for wind, and maintain consistent shooting positions. The M1903A4's accuracy made this training effective. Students could see the direct relationship between their technique and their results. A German sniper instructor who was captured in France and interrogated about training methods expressed surprise at the American emphasis on shooting at targets beyond 400 meters. German doctrine, he explained, focused on engagements at 200 to 300 meters, distances where the K-98K performed adequately and where snipers could more easily observe their targets. The American willingness to engage at longer ranges required better optics, better rifles, and better training, all of which represented resource investments that the Wehrmacht by 1944 could no longer afford. The tactical implications of this range advantage were profound. An American sniper armed with an M1903A4 could position himself 500 to 600 meters from a German position and begin systematic elimination of officers, machine gun crews, and mortar teams. German snipers attempting to counter-snipe faced a dilemma: move into effective range of the American and expose themselves, or remain at safe distance and accept their inability to suppress the threat. Artillery and mortar fire could drive the American sniper from his position, but locating a well-concealed marksman required time and ammunition that German forces often lacked. The result was a tactical asymmetry where single American snipers could fix entire enemy units in place, denying them freedom of movement and forcing them to expend resources on a threat they could not easily eliminate. This was force multiplication in its purest form, one man with the right weapon holding 100 men at bay. German after-action reports from the Western Front in late 1944 increasingly mentioned sniper harassment as a significant factor in defensive operations. Units reported being unable to move during daylight, officers refusing to expose themselves even briefly, and widespread demoralization among soldiers who felt vulnerable to an enemy they could not see or effectively counter. These reports filtered up through command channels, eventually reaching ordnance officers who connected the tactical complaints to the technical evaluations coming from testing facilities like Kummersdorf. The reports created an uncomfortable narrative. American snipers were not just numerous, but equipped with weapons that gave them a measurable technical advantage. For an army that had built its identity around technical and tactical superiority, this was a bitter realization. The Americans were beating them at their own game, using mass-produced rifles that performed like custom weapons. Weiss's reports included tactical recommendations based on his technical findings. He suggested that German sniper doctrine needed to account for the American range advantage, proposing that Wehrmacht snipers avoid direct engagement with American marksmen and instead focus on asymmetric responses. Ambushes at close range, nighttime operations, and integration with machine gun teams that could provide suppressive fire. He also recommended accelerated development of improved German sniper optics, specifically 8 to 10 power scopes that could narrow the observational advantage American snipers enjoyed. These recommendations were technically sound but operationally irrelevant by late 1944. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce new optics in meaningful quantities, and tactical doctrine changes required time and resources that no longer existed. Weiss's suggestions were noted, filed, and forgotten, but the doctrine embodied in the M1903 would outlive the war. After 1945, military forces worldwide studied American sniper employment and adopted similar approaches. The Soviet Union developed sniper programs that emphasized extended range engagement and independent operation. The British refined their own sniper doctrine to incorporate lessons learned from observing American operations. Even the reformed West German Bundeswehr, when it established sniper programs in the 1950s, drew heavily on American practices. The rifle that Weiss had examined became the ancestor of a lineage of precision weapons designed for standoff engagement. The M40 in Vietnam, the M24 in the Gulf War, the M2010 in Afghanistan. Each generation of rifles improved on the Springfield's design, but the core doctrine remained unchanged. Give trained marksmen weapons accurate enough to dominate terrain at extended ranges, and they will control the battlefield far beyond their numbers. If this story has surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. The irony was not lost on military historians who later studied the M1903A4's development. The rifle was based on a design from 1903, itself derived from the German Mauser action. The Americans had taken a German concept, refined it through industrial engineering, and produced a weapon that outperformed its German ancestors. This was not technological theft, but technological evolution, the natural process by which good ideas were adopted, improved, and integrated into new systems. The Germans had pioneered the bolt-action rifle and the concept of the precision marksman. The Americans had democratized it, creating a system where ordinary soldiers could be transformed into extraordinary shooters through good equipment and systematic training. The student had surpassed the teacher, not through genius, but through disciplined application of industrial processes and tactical doctrine. Weiss understood this, which made his reports all the more devastating to Wehrmacht pride. He was not just saying the Americans had built a better rifle, he was explaining that they had built a better system, production, training, and doctrine all integrated to create battlefield effects that Germany could not match. The rifle was merely the visible manifestation of that systemic advantage. Destroying one rifle changed nothing. The factories would produce another. The training programs would prepare another sniper. The doctrine would deploy them where they could exert maximum effect. Germany was not losing to American marksmanship. It was losing to American organizational capacity. The M1903A4 was proof written in steel. The nation that could mobilize its industrial and human resources most effectively would ultimately prevail, regardless of individual excellence or tactical brilliance. By late 1944, that lesson was being taught on every front, and rifles like the one Weiss examined were among the most articulate teachers. The American sniper who carried rifle number 3407821 died on October 9, 1944, 3 days before his weapon arrived at Kummersdorf. His name was recorded in casualty reports as Private First Class James Theodore Mackay, aged 23, from rural Montana. He had been operating independently for 6 hours, positioned in the ruins of a stone farmhouse overlooking a German supply route. Witnesses reported he had eliminated at least 7 enemy soldiers, 3 officers identifiable by binoculars and map cases, 2 machine gun crew members, and 2 soldiers attempting to establish a mortar position. A Wehrmacht company commander, frustrated by the harassment and unable to locate the sniper's position, called for mortar support. The 3rd round struck the farmhouse directly, collapsing the upper floor. German soldiers who reached the ruins found Mackay's body in the rubble, his rifle intact beside him. They also found a small notebook containing range estimates, wind observations, and a letter addressed to someone named Sarah. The letter was never delivered. Mackay's military file, declassified decades later, revealed a young man who had grown up hunting in the mountains of Montana, where long-range shooting was a practical skill required for elk and mule deer. He had enlisted in 1942, completed basic training at Fort Benning, and been selected for sniper school based on his demonstrated marksmanship. His training records showed consistent performance in the top 10% of his class, with particular strength in fieldcraft and camouflage. After completing sniper school, he was assigned to the 28th Infantry Division and deployed to France in July 1944. Between July and October, he participated in 8 major engagements and an unknown number of independent operations. His company commander's evaluation, written 2 weeks before Mackay's death, described him as quiet, reliable, and exceptionally effective in suppressing enemy movement. There was no mention of heroism or exceptional bravery, just competent execution of assigned duties. He was, in the bureaucratic language of military records, a satisfactory soldier. But the German reports told a different story. The company that had called in the mortar strike filed an after-action report describing the suppression of an enemy sharpshooter who had inflicted unacceptable casualties and prevented daylight movement for several hours. The report estimated the sniper had been operating from a range of approximately 500 to 600 meters, beyond effective counter-sniper range for available K98K rifles. The company commander noted that attempts to locate the sniper using binoculars had failed due to excellent concealment, and that only indirect fire had proven effective in neutralizing the threat. The tone of the report was clinical, but the subtext was clear. The American sniper had dominated the tactical situation until eliminated by overwhelming firepower. One man with a rifle had required a company-level response and had died only because the Germans were willing to expend scarce ammunition to stop him. That was force multiplication measured in German frustration and casualties. Mackay's rifle survived the building collapse because it had been positioned separately from where he took cover. When the mortar round struck, Mackay apparently attempted to move to a more protected position, but was caught by falling debris. The rifle, propped against a wall 3 meters away, remained intact. German soldiers who recovered it noted that the weapon appeared functional despite the dust and rubble. They also recovered 63 rounds of .30-06 ammunition, a canteen, a small pair of binoculars, And the notebook. The notebook contained pages of handwritten notes. Wind left to right, estimate 8 mph. Range to road junction, 520 meters. Officer with map, grey coat, eliminated. And these were not the writings of a man engaged in adventure or glory-seeking. They were the work notes of a professional completing a dangerous job with systematic attention to detail. The last entry, dated October 9th, read, "Position compromised. Relocating after dark." He never got the chance. The letter found in Mackay's pocket was addressed to Sarah Mackay in Billings, Montana. It was sealed, but not mailed, suggesting Mackay had been writing it over several days and had not yet finished. German soldiers, acting under regulations regarding enemy correspondence, forwarded the letter through military postal channels to the International Red Cross, which eventually delivered it to Sarah Mackay in early 1945, along with notification of her brother's death. The letter's contents were never made public, but family correspondence preserved in Montana historical archives indicates that Mackay had written about the landscape of France, the exhaustion of combat, and his hope to return home to help with the family ranch. There was apparently no mention of his sniper work, no description of the men he had killed, no reflection on the moral weight of his role. He had compartmentalized his war experience, presenting his sister with a carefully edited version that protected her from knowledge she did not need to carry. Mackay was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for valor, a decoration presented to his family in a brief ceremony at Fort Missoula in March 1945. The citation mentioned his exceptional performance in combat operations and his courage under fire, but did not specify his role as a sniper or detail his actions. This vagueness was typical of sniper citations during World War II. The U.S. military had complex feelings about soldiers whose primary role was killing individual enemies from concealment. Snipers were essential assets, but there was something uncomfortable about celebrating their work too openly. The institutional ambivalence was reflected in the decoration process. Snipers received recognition, but often in generic language that could apply to any combat soldier. Mackay's family received the medal, a folded flag, and a letter from his commanding officer praising his service. They did not receive the rifle, which was now in German hands, and they never learned that enemy engineers had spent weeks studying the weapon their brother had carried, never knew that his rifle had impressed an enemy army. The German company that killed Mackay suffered its own casualties in the engagement. The sniper had eliminated 3 officers, creating command disruptions that delayed operations and forced hasty reorganization. The machine gun crew Mackay eliminated had been positioned to cover a road junction. Its loss opened a gap in German defenses that was later exploited by an American patrol. The 2 soldiers working to establish a mortar position had been killed before they could complete setup, denying the Germans indirect fire capability they needed for the next phase of their defensive plan. In military terms, Mackay's 6 hours of work had generated tactical effects far exceeding his individual contribution. He had disrupted enemy operations, degraded their combat power, and forced them to expend resources, time, ammunition, leadership focus on neutralizing a single soldier threat. This was the doctrine made real. 1 man, 1 rifle, multiplied force through precision and patience. Mackay was buried in a temporary military cemetery near the town where he died. After the war, his remains were repatriated to Montana at his family's request and interred in the small cemetery outside Billings, where his parents would eventually be buried alongside him. His gravestone listed his name, rank, dates of birth and death, and the notation Bronze Star. Visitors to the cemetery would have no way of knowing that the young man buried there had been a sniper, no indication that his rifle had impressed enemy engineers, no hint that German officers had studied his weapon and written reports about American technical superiority. The silence that followed the shot, The silence that had allowed him to operate undetected for 6 hours had extended beyond his death, erasing the specific details of his service and leaving only the generic memorial language that applied to all fallen soldiers. The rifle spoke volumes to those who understood its language. The gravestone remained mute. When Soviet forces overran Kummersdorf on April 21, 1945, they found a facility in systematic disarray. German personnel had attempted to evacuate or destroy sensitive materials, but the speed of the Soviet advance left much intact. Among the items recovered were testing records, enemy weapons evaluations, and the weapons themselves. Hundreds of rifles, machine guns, pistols, and optical devices captured from Allied and Soviet forces. The M1903 Springfield, with serial number 340781, was found in a secure storage room, tagged with the designation 4A771 and accompanied by Oberst Weiss's 47-page technical evaluation. A Soviet technical intelligence team inventoried the material, photographed the key documents, and shipped everything to Moscow for further analysis. The rifle that had killed German soldiers, impressed German engineers, and embodied American industrial capacity was about to begin its third act. As a museum piece and historical lesson, the Soviet ordnance engineers who examined Weiss's report found it fascinating for reasons that had nothing to do with the rifle's accuracy. What interested them was the methodology. The systematic testing, the comparative analysis, the honest acknowledgement of enemy technical superiority. Soviet military culture, shaped by decades of authoritarian control and ideological orthodoxy, rarely encouraged such candid technical assessment. Engineers who reported uncomfortable truths about Soviet weapons shortcomings risked political consequences. Yet here was a German officer serving a similarly authoritarian regime, producing an honest, technical document that admitted his nation's weapons were inferior in key respects. The report became a case study in Soviet technical institutes, not because of what it said about rifles, but because of what it revealed about the importance of objective engineering analysis. Weiss's work, preserved by accident of history, influenced Soviet weapons development more after the war than it had influenced German production during it. The M1903 itself was eventually transferred to the Central Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow, where it was displayed in an exhibit on captured enemy weapons. The accompanying placard, written in Russian, described it as an American sniper rifle, M1903 Springfield, captured from fascist forces, 1945. There was no mention of Mackay, no reference to Weiss's evaluation, no acknowledgement of the rifle's journey from Massachusetts to Montana, to France, to Germany, to Russia. It was simply a relic, one among thousands, interesting primarily for its association with American Lend-Lease support and the technological competition between industrial powers. Museum visitors in the 1950s and 1960s would have seen it as a curiosity, a footnote to the larger story of Soviet victory. The rifle that had prompted weeks of German engineering analysis became a prop in a different narrative, its specific history erased by the needs of Cold War historiography. Oberst Friedrich Weiss survived the war by 6 months. He died in November 1945 in a displaced persons camp in Bavaria, officially from pneumonia, but more accurately from exhaustion, malnutrition, and the accumulated stress of Germany's collapse. He had spent the final months of the war managing logistics in increasingly chaotic conditions, then endured the immediate post-war period as Allied forces processed millions of former Wehrmacht personnel. No one in the camp knew about his technical work or his reports on the Springfield rifle. He was simply another former officer waiting for processing, indistinguishable from thousands of others. He left no personal papers, no memoir, no letters explaining his thoughts on the war or his work. His professional legacy consisted of technical reports filed in archives that would remain classified for decades. His name appeared in no histories of weapons development, no studies of wartime engineering, no accounts of how Nazi Germany confronted its own technical limitations. He became, like most soldiers and engineers, a footnote at best, but his reports survived. When American forces captured German ordnance records in 1945, they microfilmed thousands of pages of technical documentation, including Weiss's evaluation of the M1903. These films were eventually deposited in the National Archives in Washington, where they sat largely unexamined until the 1980s, when military historians researching sniper weapons development discovered them. Weiss's analysis, translated into English, provided unexpected insight into how German engineers viewed American weapons production. The reports also confirmed what American ordnance officers had believed but never proven, that the M1903A4 was genuinely superior to the K98K in accuracy and optical performance. This confirmation came too late to affect any wartime decisions, but proved valuable for historians trying to understand the technical aspects of World War II infantry combat. Weiss's work, suppressed during the war, finally found an audience 4 decades after his death. The rifle itself remained in Soviet hands until 1992, when the collapse of the USSR led to reorganization of military museums and archives. In the chaos of that period, many items were sold, traded, or simply disappeared. The M1903, with serial number 3407821, surfaced at a firearms auction in Germany in 1995, listed as a Wu American sniper rifle, provenance uncertain. The auction catalogue noted the rifle's excellent condition and included photographs showing the Untold scope and the German inspection tag still attached. A private collector purchased the rifle for an undisclosed sum, unaware of its specific history. The rifle changed hands twice more before being donated to a military museum in Virginia in 2008, where it remains on display in an exhibit about World War II small arms. The museum's placard identifies it as an M1903A4 sniper rifle and notes that it was recovered from German capture, but provides no further details. Visitors who examine the rifle have no way of knowing about Mackay, Weiss, or the journey from Montana to Moscow. Mackay's family learned nothing of the rifle's fate. They knew only that James had died in combat, that he had served as a sniper, and that his weapon had been buried with him or lost. The bronze star and the folded flag were their tangible connections to his service. Sarah Mackay, who had received the unfinished letter, never married and spent her life managing the family ranch outside Billings. She died in 1989, taking with her whatever private memories she had of her brother and whatever the letter had contained. The Montana Historical Society's archives include a brief oral history interview conducted with Sarah in 1973, in which she mentioned James only in passing. "My brother served in the war. He didn't talk much about it in his letters. He wanted to come home and help with the ranch, but he didn't make it. No mention of snipers, German engineers, or rifles that impressed enemy armies." The specific had dissolved into the general, the extraordinary had become ordinary, and the documentation had scattered across archives and museums on 3 continents. The historical record preserved fragments but lost the narrative. Researchers can find Mackay's casualty report, Weiss's technical evaluation, and the museum displays in Virginia and Moscow. They can piece together parts of the story from scattered sources. But no single document connects all the elements. No archive holds the complete chain of events from Montana to Kummersdorf to Moscow to Virginia. The rifle exists, the reports exist, the records exist, but they exist in isolation, separated by institutional boundaries, linguistic barriers, and the simple passage of time. The story of how an American sniper's rifle impressed German engineers and influenced Soviet technical culture remains fractured, knowable only through careful assembly of dispersed evidence. This is how history often works, not as coherent narrative, but as archaeological reconstruction, fragments assembled into provisional understanding, always incomplete, always subject to revision when new evidence emerges. The rifle remains. The rest requires interpretation. In 2023, a researcher at the Virginia Military Museum, where the M1903 resides, discovered German inspection markings on the rifle's receiver that had been previously overlooked. The markings, partially obscured by decades of handling and storage, included the designation 4A771 and a date stamp, 14x44, October 14, 1944. This finding prompted deeper archival research that eventually connected the rifle to Oberst Weiss's reports in the National Archives. For the first time, the physical weapon could be linked definitively to the German technical evaluation that had so thoroughly analyzed its capabilities. The researcher published a paper in a military history journal detailing the connection and tracing the rifle's journey from American production to German capture to Soviet acquisition to its current location. The paper generated modest interest among weapons historians and collectors, but made no impact on broader historical understanding of World War II. It was a footnote to a footnote, the kind of specialized knowledge that matters intensely to a small community of experts and remains invisible to everyone else. But for those who understood the significance, the rifle represented something profound. Physical evidence of how warfare had changed between 1914 and 1944, and how industrial capacity had become as important as tactical brilliance. The Great War had been fought by armies equipped with rifles that were fundamentally 19th century weapons modified for 20th century production. The M1903 itself was derived from a design concept dating to the 1890s. Yet by 1944, the same basic mechanical action had been refined through industrial engineering to produce a weapon that could reliably hit targets at ranges its designers had barely imagined. This was not breakthrough innovation. It was incremental improvement compounded over decades, the patient application of metallurgical knowledge, manufacturing precision, and quality control. The rifle embodied a truth that military historians had recognized but rarely articulated. Modern warfare was won not by genius, but by systematic competence, not by heroes, but by supply chains, not by brilliant strategy, but by the unglamorous work of ensuring that millions of ordinary soldiers had equipment slightly better than their enemies. The comparison between the M1903 and the K98K illustrated this principle. Both rifles used the same basic bolt-action mechanism. Both fired cartridges of similar power and ballistics. Both were equipped with optical sights. Yet the American rifle shot measurably better because American engineers had applied tighter tolerances, American inspectors had rejected more defective parts, and American doctrine had prioritized long-range accuracy over other considerations. The difference was not genius, it was discipline. The Germans had the technical knowledge to build rifles as good as the Springfield. They had invented most of the underlying concepts. What they lacked by 1944 was the industrial capacity to maintain those standards across mass production while simultaneously fighting a multi-front war. The Americans, protected by oceans and possessed of vast industrial resources, could afford to be meticulous. Quality control is expensive. Victory goes to those who can afford it. Weiss had understood this, which was why his reports were so politically dangerous. He was not just saying the Americans had built a better rifle. He was explaining that they had built a better system for building rifles, and by extension, a better system for fighting wars. Individual German soldiers might be braver, German officers might be more tactically skilled, German engineers might be more creative. But none of that mattered if the other side could produce 10 rifles for every one you built, and make each of those 10 rifles shoot straighter than yours. Weiss's crime was telling the truth in a regime that required optimistic lies. His punishment was exile to irrelevance and ultimately death in obscurity. His vindication came decades later, when historians found his reports and recognized them as rare examples of honest technical assessment in a military culture that discouraged uncomfortable analysis. The rifle had outlived him by 80 years and counting. His work, buried for half a century, finally found its audience. Mackay never knew any of this. He knew his rifle worked, knew he could trust it, and that knowledge was sufficient for the 6 hours he spent dominating a German-held road junction. He did not need to understand barrel harmonics, or headspace tolerances, or the industrial processes that had produced his weapon. He needed to know that when he aligned the crosshairs and pressed the trigger, the bullet would go where he aimed. The rifle delivered on that promise repeatedly until a mortar round ended the conversation. In that sense, Mackay got exactly what a soldier needs from his equipment: reliability, accuracy, and the confidence that the weapon will not fail when everything depends on it. The engineers who built the rifle, the inspectors who verified its quality, the ordnance officers who specified its standards, they all succeeded in their mission to equip American soldiers with tools adequate to their tasks. Mackay's death was not a failure of equipment, but a consequence of combat's fundamental asymmetry. The side with indirect fire wins against the side with rifles, no matter how accurate those rifles might be. The rifle now sits behind climate-controlled glass in Virginia, illuminated by carefully calibrated lighting that prevents UV damage to the wood and metal. The inertial scope is still mounted, its crosshairs still aligned, though the rifle has not been fired since German engineers test-fired it in 1944. Museum conservation standards prohibit live firing of historical artifacts, so the weapon's accuracy remains theoretical, frozen at the moment of its last use. In 2023, a researcher at the Virginia Military Museum, where the M1903 resides, discovered German inspection markings on the rifle's receiver that had been previously overlooked. The markings, partially obscured by decades of handling and storage, included the designation 4A771 and a date stamp, 14x44, October 14, 1944. This finding prompted deeper archival research that eventually connected the rifle to Oberst Weiss's reports in the National Archives. For the first time, the physical weapon could be linked definitively to the German technical evaluation that had so thoroughly analyzed its capabilities. The researcher published a paper in a military history journal detailing the connection and tracing the rifle's journey from American production to German capture to Soviet acquisition to its current location. The paper generated modest interest among weapons historians and collectors, but made no impact on broader historical understanding of World War II. It was a footnote to a footnote, the kind of specialized knowledge that matters intensely to a small community of experts and remains invisible to everyone else. But for those who understood the significance, the rifle represented something profound. Physical evidence of how warfare had changed between 1914 and 1944, and how industrial capacity had become as important as tactical brilliance. The Great War had been fought by armies equipped with rifles that were fundamentally 19th century weapons modified for 20th century production. The M1903 itself was derived from a design concept dating to the 1890s. Yet by 1944, the same basic mechanical action had been refined through industrial engineering to produce a weapon that could reliably hit targets at ranges its designers had barely imagined. This was not breakthrough innovation. It was incremental improvement compounded over decades, the patient application of metallurgical knowledge, manufacturing precision, and quality control. The rifle embodied a truth that military historians had recognized but rarely articulated. Modern warfare was won not by genius, but by systematic competence. Not by heroes, but by supply chains. Not by brilliant strategy, but by the unglamorous work of ensuring that millions of ordinary soldiers had equipment slightly better than their enemies. The comparison between the M1903 and the K98K illustrated this principle. Both rifles used the same basic bolt-action mechanism. Both fired cartridges of similar power and ballistics. Both were equipped with optical sights. Yet the American rifle shot measurably better because American engineers had applied tighter tolerances, American inspectors had rejected more defective parts, and American doctrine had prioritized long-range accuracy over other considerations. The difference was not genius, it was discipline. The Germans had the technical knowledge to build rifles as good as the Springfield. They had invented most of the underlying concepts. What they lacked by 1944 was the industrial capacity to maintain those standards across mass production while simultaneously fighting a multi-front war. The Americans, protected by oceans and possessed of vast industrial resources, could afford to be meticulous. Quality control is expensive. Victory goes to those who can afford it. Weiss had understood this, which was why his reports were so politically dangerous. He was not just saying the Americans had built a better rifle. He was explaining that they had built a better system for building rifles, and by extension, a better system for fighting wars. Individual German soldiers might be braver. German officers might be more tactically skilled. German engineers might be more creative. But none of that mattered if the other side could produce 10 rifles for every one you built, and make each of those 10 rifles shoot straighter than yours. Weiss's crime was telling the truth in a regime that required optimistic lies. His punishment was exile to irrelevance and ultimately death in obscurity. His vindication came decades later, when historians found his reports and recognized them as rare examples of honest technical assessment in a military culture that discouraged uncomfortable analysis. The rifle had outlived him by 80 years, and counting. His work, buried for half a century, finally found its audience. Mackay never knew any of this. He knew his rifle worked, knew he could trust it, and that knowledge was sufficient for the 6 hours he spent dominating a German-held road junction. He did not need to understand barrel harmonics, or headspace tolerances, or the industrial processes that had produced his weapon. He needed to know that when he aligned the crosshairs and pressed the trigger, the bullet would go where he aimed. The rifle delivered on that promise repeatedly until a mortar round ended the conversation. In that sense, Mackay got exactly what a soldier needs from his equipment: reliability, accuracy, and the confidence that the weapon will not fail when everything depends on it. The engineers who built the rifle, the inspectors who verified its quality, the ordnance officers who specified its standards, they all succeeded in their mission to equip American soldiers with tools adequate to their tasks. Mackay's death was not a failure of equipment, but a consequence of combat's fundamental asymmetry. The side with indirect fire wins against the side with rifles, no matter how accurate those rifles might be. The rifle now sits behind climate-controlled glass in Virginia, illuminated by carefully calibrated lighting that prevents UV damage to the wood and metal. The Untold scope is still mounted, its crosshairs still aligned, though the rifle has not been fired since German engineers test-fired it in 1944. Museum conservation standards prohibit live firing of historical artifacts, so the weapon's accuracy remains theoretical, frozen at the moment of its last use. Visitors occasionally stop to examine it, drawn by the placard that mentions its capture by German forces, though most move on quickly to more dramatic exhibits: tanks, aircraft, medals, flags. The rifle does not speak to casual observers. It requires context that few possess: knowledge of manufacturing processes, understanding of ballistic principles, awareness of how small advantages compound into decisive battlefield effects. Without that context, it is simply an old rifle in a case, interesting primarily for its age. But for those with eyes trained to read steel and wood, the rifle remains eloquent. The wear patterns on the stock tell the story of field use under harsh conditions. The scope mounting system speaks to engineering sophistication rarely seen in military equipment. The barrel, measured with modern instruments, still holds tolerances that would satisfy contemporary precision shooters. The rifle is a time capsule, preserving in physical form the moment when American industrial capacity reached a level that allowed mass production of genuinely precision weapons. It marks the transition from rifles as craft objects to rifles as industrial products that happen to shoot as well as handmade pieces. That transition changed warfare permanently. Modern military rifles, the M4, the HK416, the SCAR, are all descendants of that industrial philosophy, designed for consistent performance, manufacture to tight tolerances, test to verify quality, deploy in numbers sufficient to equip entire armies. The lineage runs directly from the Springfield Armory of 1943 to the factories producing weapons today. The story that connects Mackay, Weiss, and the rifle has no neat conclusion because history rarely provides such things. Mackay died doing his job. Weiss died in obscurity after doing his job too honestly. The rifle survived through chance and institutional inertia. Three separate trajectories intersected briefly in October 1944, creating a moment of technical and human significance that was immediately buried by the chaos of a collapsing war. Decades later, researchers pieced together fragments of the story, creating a narrative that exists more in archives than in public memory. This is typical. Most of history's small dramas play out unseen, their participants unaware they are creating moments that later historians will study. The soldiers fighting wars do not think about how their equipment will be analyzed 80 years later. The engineers designing weapons do not imagine their work becoming museum exhibits. The officers writing technical reports do not expect their honesty to be preserved as rare examples of integrity in authoritarian systems. Yet these small dramas matter because they illuminate larger truths. The story of this rifle is the story of how industrial democracies fight wars, not through individual heroism or tactical genius, though both have their place, but through systematic application of resources, methodical improvement of processes, and willingness to learn from failures. It is the story of how honest technical assessment can be a form of moral courage, especially when such honesty contradicts official narratives. It is the story of how individual soldiers become statistics, their specific experiences erased by the generic language of casualty reports and medal citations, leaving only fragments, a rifle, a report, a gravestone, as evidence they existed at all. And it is the story of how objects outlive people, carrying forward physical evidence of events that would otherwise be forgotten, speaking in the silent language of steel to those who know how to listen. The war ended. The rifle did not. The steel remembers what the living have forgotten. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Private First Class James Theodore Mackay and Oberst Friedrich Weiss. See you in the next video.